Viewers relied on as a ray of hope and truth for many years. But what if your entire worldview was based on lies? In a startling development, Jonathan Lamb eventually speaks up and discloses the truth about what actually transpired behind closed doors. What happened to the billions? Who was in charge? Why was the truth kept a secret for so long? There is more to this controversy than just money. A worldwide ministry's basis is rocked by this deception. From Jonathan Lamb was considered Daystar's heir apparent from the start. He was more than Marcus Lamb's son. He represented the future of a Christian media empire worth billions of dollars. Everyone in the ministry was aware of it. It wasn't wishful thinking or a rumor. Officially, it was. They had drafted, signed, and sealed the leadership plan. Jonathan was slated to succeed his father as Daystar's president. It was neither a possibility nor a maybe. It was the plan, which had been in place for years. Jonathan didn't grow up watching from the sidelines. He participated and gained first-hand knowledge of everything. He worked behind the scenes, led teams, hosted shows, and preached. He was getting ready to carry the torch one step at a time. He was respected and his name held weight. The path appeared clear to the outer world. Jonathan would carry on the tradition that Marcus had established. It was a family and legacy leadership. Inheritance of power, faith, and responsibility in addition to financial wealth. However, after Marcus died in 2021, everyone thought Jonathan would inevitably take over his father's role. And for an instant, it appeared as though that was precisely what was taking place. Jonathan was appointed vice president. Susie, his wife, also assumed a more significant role. Their pay rose. They gained more clout within the ministry. Everything was coming together on paper. They were taking on the roles they had previously played. Promised and ready for. However, something wasn't quite right behind the scenes. The majority of people were unaware that Jonathan was receiving more than just a title. He was entering a framework. And there were both explicit and implicit expectations associated with that structure. He was being asked to do more than lead. He was being asked to safeguard a well-constructed image. When things didn't line up, that meant being silent. This required avoiding difficult discussions. To keep the peace, he had to comply with decisions that made him uneasy. At that point, we were more prepared. More so than before. At home, it began to weigh on him. I mean, it was the struggle and breaking of me pleading with God, when will Jonathan be ready? Late at night, he would raise tough questions to Susie. They weren't upset. They were burdened, but not resentful. They began to see that Jonathan's calling extended beyond leadership. He had to make a decision. Which would he choose? The one that God was pulling at in his heart, or the one that was set out for him? The true anxiety started at that point because, from the outside, everything appeared to be going well: the platform, the power, the income. However, there was a profound uneasiness within. Jonathan questioned whether he could be Daystar's leader without sacrificing some aspect of himself. He thought that ascending to that throne could require him to abandon his true self. And he was completely shaken by that understanding. The job was no longer the only thing on the mind. It has to do with conscience. It has to do with faith. The question was whether obedience was more valuable than legacy. It was a difficult decision. When something has been handed to them, who turns it down? A title that millions would aspire to is something that no one gives up. Susie and Jonathan, however, weren't pursuing the idea. Peace was what they were after. And faking didn't bring them any peace. They couldn't appear to be dying on the inside while yet grinning on camera. Therefore, they decided to take a silent, drastic step back, not because they didn't care, but due to their excessive concern. A future that had been promised in writing was abandoned by them. From a name that had weighed in Christian circles worldwide, to a leadership position that most people would battle for. And they did it because they couldn't live a lie, not to make a statement. They were unable to exchange truth for a throne or even for titles. They walked into something even bigger by stepping away from what was expected. Their story's power lies in its freedom, peace, and alignment. Since the throne was genuine and the potential was enormous. However, Jonathan was aware that it wasn't worth it if it meant losing his soul. Therefore, no one ever claimed the throne. He made a better decision, not because he failed. It was not during a storm that Jonathan and Susie Lamb left Daystar. An angry social media post, a dramatic scene, an explosive fight, or a tell-all interview were all absent. It appeared to be very peaceful from the outside. However, the majority of people were unaware that their departure was not an abrupt one. Months, if not years, of wrestling, praying, wondering, sobbing, and listening led to it. There was no meltdown here. It was a gradual, intensely private uprising. Against a system that no longer matched their hearts, not against individuals. Jonathan had already been assured of everything. Long before his father, Marcus Lamb, died, he had officially begun his journey to leadership. Jonathan took over as vice president following Marcus's death, and the presidency was the logical next step. Everything was laid up in writing. Susie, his wife, also assumed a bigger responsibility and a higher salary. They were stable for the first time in their lives. No more struggling financially or feeling under pressure to support a family on sporadic income. They were well known, had a respectable title, a pleasant home, and a clear way to go. But something inside began to fall apart. Initially, there were only brief episodes of discomfort. Questions that persisted. It seemed strange that decisions were being taken behind closed doors. Meetings where honesty was not as valued as quiet. As they gained more experience in leadership, they came to see how much the system depended on maintaining a positive image, even at the expense of ignoring unpleasant realities. Jonathan was supposed to do more than just run the ministry. He was supposed to maintain the machine's functionality. Just perform, smile, and preserve the tradition without making any waves or raising any public concerns. However, that legacy became burdensome. It was no longer based solely on faith. It was founded on control over the media, power, and politics behind the scenes. Susie and Jonathan found it increasingly difficult to accept what was happening as they witnessed more. They couldn't lie to themselves, but they also weren't seeking a conflict. They hadn't committed to this, and they most certainly didn't want to leave it to their kids. After the sessions were completed and the cameras had been turned off, Jonathan would sit with Susie late at night and repeatedly pose the same agonizing questions. Are we acting appropriately? Are we being faithful? Or are we simply keeping quiet to maintain harmony? They were broken by such moments. The internal conflict, not external pressure. Some believed that they ought to remain and attempt internal reform. They were respected, powerful, and influential, after all. Why not simply assume command and steer Daystar in a more positive direction? In actuality, though, they couldn't just make changes to the system. They had to give their all to something they no longer believed in. Staying would have required daily make a compromise with their own spirits, not merely their choices. They were unable to accomplish that. Not for legacy, not for a title, not for a paycheck. There was no cheering when they decided to go. It was accompanied with fear. It was accompanied by loss. Everything changed when they said no more. The guaranteed income disappeared. The platform vanished. Their impact faded into the background after being created for years. They were aware of what they were forfeiting. They didn't walk away rich, and they just recognized it wasn't worth maintaining. Jonathan and Susie weren't sitting on millions of dollars, despite what the public believed. Their mortgage was still in effect. Their invoices were still there. They had children to take care of. Neither a secret trust fund nor a secret exit package existed. With nothing except one another, they left Daystar. Their beliefs and their trust that God would supply in some way. That's why their uprising was so expensive and so silent. They did not vent on podcasts. On social media, they did not disparage anyone. To attract disciples, they didn't attempt to launch a new ministry brand. The real test started when they just took a step back, closed the door, and said, "God, we're scared, but we trust you more than the system we left." They had to start anew without Daystar's organization, prestige, or financial support. However, this time, they were creating something new. Nor a legacy, nor a brand, but a modest, submissive life of faith. It wasn't glitzy. It was not remarkable. It was honest, difficult, emotional, and unvarnished. According to Susie, peace isn't the absence of conflict. It is the existence of a purpose amidst ambiguity. And that's just what they entered. A new life, one that was characterized by alignment and honesty rather than praise or safety. Although they knew they had made the right decision, they didn't have all the answers. The correct choice. Through action rather than words, their silent revolt made a strong statement. The world learned that power isn't everything from it. A life based on truth cannot be replaced by a ministry based on performance. That giving up doesn't always mean failing. It's the most faithful thing you can do at times. Susie and Jonathan could have stayed. They could have picked up the check while grinning for the cameras. No one would have held them accountable if they had maintained the throne and preserved the reputation. It would have been the most comfortable and straightforward route. However, they made a more difficult and pious choice. They left because the purpose had evolved and they were unable to adapt to it, not because they didn't enjoy it. It's not simply what they sacrificed that gives their narrative such impact. That's what they decided to do instead. They opted for silence over self-aggrandizement, conviction over expediency, and peace over power. They demonstrated that true leadership isn't necessarily about taking the stage by doing this. Sometimes it entails leaving it peacefully, courageously, and completely surrendered. Doors weren't slammed. No movement was started by them. To present their position, they didn't start a campaign. They simply departed. And that kind of subdued disobedience is uncommon and extremely expensive in a society that is fixated on appearance and influence. However, that's what gives it its potency. They did it without regret and paid the price. Not everyone was aware of their decision. There are still some that don't. However, Susie and Jonathan are aware of the costs and savings. It preserved their sense of purpose, their faith, their tranquility, and the future of their children. Ultimately, that was far more valuable than any salary. The Lamb family appeared to be the epitome of success from the outside. Daystar was a global Christian media network with billions of dollars in revenue. It was a top-tier studio. The caliber of the production was polished, and millions of people saw the platform. The stage, the lights, and the cameras. Everything suggested that this was a strong, affluent empire rather than merely a ministry. Additionally, people assumed things when they saw Jonathan and Susie Lamb on screen. They thought, wow, they must be loaded, after noticing the last name, the luxury attire, and the stage presence. The Lambs were perceived as belonging to a ministry dynasty that was affluent. However, most people never witnessed the truth that lay behind the well-preserved picture. For years, Jonathan and Susie were burdened by that myth. They were supposed to live like celebrities. They thought the Lambs had fancy automobiles, second homes in the Alps, private jets, and a comfortable lifestyle. Nobody understood, however, how far that perception was from reality. It was easier, dirtier, and much more relatable than anyone had thought. Jonathan and Susie lived like any other young couple for the majority of their ministry life. Establishing a budget, handling debt, and raising a family while putting your faith in God to supply. They experienced months when they weren't sure how things would turn out and seasons of severe financial strain. They were merely trying to make ends meet, while those outside of them dreamed of luxury and comfort. At one point, Susie's pay was lower than that of a full-time coffee shop employee. Nevertheless, she continued to serve, to show up, and to give her heart to the ministry. They didn't voice any complaints. Status was not what they were after. They had faith in their actions. Susie concentrated on She never asked for more while raising their children and dedicating herself to her family and ministry. Jonathan was privately questioning whether people truly realized the pressure they were under, both financially and spiritually, while leading, speaking, and doing everything he could to uphold the legacy his father had established. It wasn't until Marcus Lamb's death that their situation began to appear more steady. Jonathan was elected vice president. Susie's pay increased significantly. They had financial breathing room for the first time in years. They wouldn't have to worry about paying their expenses. They could take care of their family, live a little more freely, and start to transition into a new period of stability. However, even that was short-lived. The income vanished overnight the moment they decided to leave Daystar. There was no safety net, no leaving package, and no Ministry Millions rich savings account. Their finances were questionable, but they left with their faith unbroken. They still had their home, their children, and all the typical costs that come with being a typical family. Without the security of a steady salary, they now had to find out how to make it all work. At that point, the myth began to crumble. Because it is common for people to presume that ministry families are returning to luxury and having a safety net when they envision them leaving platforms. Susie and Jonathan, however, did not. They had their faith, their principles, and each other. That was it. They would have to work out the rest on the fly. The fact that they felt misunderstood made it even more difficult. The public continued to perceive them as wealthy even after they distanced themselves. It was difficult to dispel the notion of the millionaire ministry family. People were unaware of the difficult discussions that took place behind closed doors, such as the possibility of having to sell their home, make cuts, or downsize. They didn't witness the budgeting meetings, the spreadsheets, or the silent prayers pleading with God to intervene. All they could see was the stage. And they had been misled by that stage. The candor with which Jonathan and Sus have handled everything is among the most compelling aspects of their story. They made no attempt to conceal it or shield their reputation. During interviews, they acknowledged feeling afraid. They acknowledged that they had doubts about the future. They discussed candidly the financial and emotional toll of leaving. No pretense, no sugarcoating. And they broke something significant in the process. They dispelled the myth that prosperity invariably accompanies blessings. Because having financial prosperity is a sign of ministry success. That the existence of cameras and lighting and people on stage are living simple, flawless lives because of microphones. They revealed that honesty was important and that this is how things actually appear. Since the myth has caused harm, many people had been hurt by the notion that ministry equated to financial gain. It had raised irrational hopes. It had caused common Christians to feel as though their modest religious lives were not sufficiently blessed. It had stoked jealousy and sowed uncertainty. It had mistaken material success for God's providence. And many who were trying their hardest to serve God without ever seeing a stage, a paycheck, or a camera were harmed by that uncertainty. The tale of Jonathan and Susie turned the script on its head. They emphasized that appearing successful is not the goal of ministry. It has to do with faithfulness. Additionally, being devoted can occasionally involve sacrificing comfort, money, and attention. At times, it entails beginning anew with only a silent faith in God. And they did precisely that. To maintain the money coming in, they didn't start a new brand. They didn't pursue the next significant chance. They just made the decision to live a different kind of life, one that was straightforward, truthful, and loyal, free from the need to perform. They prioritized their family. They put their peace first and abandoned the myth that service must entail luxury. It wasn't simple. They encountered skepticism. They were afraid. However, they also discovered something they had been lacking. Liberty. Freedom from preconceived notions. Freedom from picture. Liberty from the need to seem as though everything was flawless when it wasn't. They also found a new type of blessing in that independence. One that was not for sale. Thus, no, Jonathan and Susie Lamb left with nothing, but they did leave with everything. They left with clean hands, pure hearts, and a profound sense of tranquility. And few people ever find that level of wealth in today's world. Their narrative serves as a reminder that, in God's view, success isn't determined by metrics, reputations, or earnings. It has to do with obeying. It is about living a life that is consistent with your beliefs, even if it means sacrificing everything. It is about the truth. Because ultimately, even if the myth may be loud, the truth is more powerful. And Susie and Jonathan made the right decision. Most people think that being a leader means moving up the ladder. You put in a lot of effort, establish your worth, win others over, and eventually become the best. We are taught that model in church, business, and life. You are more successful the higher you go. And when you're from a family with a global reputation, like the Lambs, and a multi-billion-dollar ministry empire already constructed for you, leadership appears not just feasible but assured. It was expected that Jonathan Lamb would become a great man. That was the strategy. He possessed the experience, the presence, the last name, and, above all, the blessing. His father, Marcus Lamb, had created Daystar out of nothing. He transformed a modest idea into an international Christian media conglomerate. People expected Jonathan to continue it, of course. And he did for a time. He demonstrated his leadership abilities, worked inside Daystar, assumed genuine responsibility, and was always present. Jonathan was the logical choice to succeed Marcus after his death. However, being a leader isn't necessarily about taking charge. It's necessary to step down at times. And that's what makes the story of Jonathan and Susie so surprising. They had everything planned out. The respect, the money, the platform, and the influence. At last, they had everything they had fought for years. However, rather than aiming toward, they also let it go. It took time for it to happen. There were no spectacular exits or scandalous or treacherous headlines. It took place at peaceful times, during prayer, during late-night talks, and during in-depth introspection. Jonathan started to feel that he would have to compromise his beliefs in order to lead Day. The pressure to perform was there. Susie sensed that he was keeping quiet about the things that weren't right with him in order to preserve his reputation. Not only in discussions or choices, but also in the strain it placed on their household, their kids, their tranquility. It wasn't that they didn't believe in the mission, but eventually they had to ask themselves, is this what real leadership is supposed to feel like? It's easy to confuse leadership with position, but for Jonathan and Susie, the more they climbed, the more misaligned they felt. They just could no longer identify the manner in which it was being done. Power had gradually taken the place of purpose. Politics intruded. Integrity was not the deciding factor, image was. And they came to a crucial realization. You are not meant to carry authority just because it is given to you. They had the option to remain. They could have attempted to alter things from the top, retained the title, and relished the influence. Most individuals would have. It was more financially stable, more respected, and safer. However, they were aware in their hearts that continuing would have required them to perform, and they had already finished. They didn't want to be in charge of anything that didn't truly represent them. They had no desire for their children to feel lost in private yet see them thrive in public. So, not out of rage or to make a point, they left. They left with a sense of calm, humility, and a terrible clarity. And that decision, to resign rather than advance, changed leadership. Because retaining power isn't the goal of true leadership. It all comes down to knowing when to let go. It's about deciding which is more important, peace or popularity, alignment or praise. The answer was obvious to Susie and Jonathan. Instead of continuing in a role that no longer reflected who they were becoming, they would want to be loyal to their beliefs. Their story is unique, particularly in a society that values prominence, notoriety, and power. Loud, polished, and powerful leaders are frequently extolled in Christian circles. Perhaps what we actually need, though, are leaders who are quiet, truthful, and courageous enough to leave when something is wrong. Susie and Jonathan stayed behind to start their own business. They didn't seek out a new spotlight or launch a rival ministry. They just selected a distinct life. A life of service without the title, a life of faith without the cameras. They opted for truth over tradition, peace over performance, and family over celebrity. The world almost ever sees leadership like that. It's the kind that endures, but it lacks hashtags and headlines. The kind that motivates by integrity rather than strength. Perhaps that is what true leadership has always been.